OpenAI has clapped back at Microsoft around their copyright claims, but does their argument stand up to legal scrutiny? Welcome back to the AI Breakdown. Today, we are looking at OpenAI's response to a recent lawsuit from the New York Times that many are considering the most significant threat to the LLM training approach that we've yet seen. To understand OpenAI's response, let's go back to the New York Times' own announcement of their lawsuit back at the end of December. There were a couple notable things about the New York Times suit. First of all, apparently it was something that the New York Times was trying to resolve with Microsoft and OpenAI back earlier in 2023. They had approached Microsoft and OpenAI, effectively trying to license their intellectual property, as well as create, quote, technological guardrails around their products, but didn't come to any agreement. Now, OpenAI, for their part, said that those conversations had been going well, and that they were somewhat blindsided by this lawsuit. The complaint says, OpenAI seeks to free ride on the Times' massive investment in its journalism. Importantly, it accuses OpenAI and their partners at Microsoft of, quote, using the Times content without payment to create products that substitute for the Times and steal audiences away from it. In other words, they're not just alleging that OpenAI is training their LLMs on their copyrighted material, but that they are reproducing that material in such a way that someone would plausibly use ChatGPT instead of paying for a subscription to the New York Times. This will be a key part of the case. So let's look at OpenAI's blog post to get a little bit of further color. They actually break this into 4 sections. The first section is we collaborate with news organizations and are creating new opportunities. This isn't really so much a legal argument. It's more just trying to establish their bona fides that it is important to them to actually be partners with media organizations rather than just non-contributors or thievers. They write, our goals are to support a healthy news ecosystem, be a good partner, and create mutually beneficial opportunities. With this in mind, we have pursued partnerships with news organizations to achieve these objectives. Deploying our products to benefit and support readers and editors, teach our AI models about the world by training on additional historic, non-publicly available content, display real-time content with attribution in ChatGPT, providing new ways for news publishers to connect with readers. They point to partnerships with AP, Axel Springer, the American Journalism Project, and NYU as an example of how they're approaching that. Now, where their legal arguments start is in Section 2. They write, training is fair use, but we provide an opt-out because it's the right thing to do. They argue training AI models using publicly available internet materials is fair use as supported by long-standing and widely accepted precedents. We view this principle as fair to creators, necessary for innovators, and critical for US competitiveness. Now, basically, this is just a list of links to their arguments or to precedential arguments for why they believe this. But obviously, this is going to be the very crux of this case and any other case that makes it to eventually the Supreme Court. The key overarching question of all of this AI training is whether training is actually fair use. Now, their argument for why, if they believe that training is fair use, would they allow for an opt-out, which you remember they started doing last year, their argument is, quote, legal right is less important to us than being good citizens. What about the idea that ChatGPT reproduced something from Wirecutter in almost exact detail? Well, they write, regurgitation is a rare bug that we are working to drive to zero. They say, our models were designed and trained to learn concepts in order to apply them to new problems. Memorization is a rare failure of the learning process that we are continually making progress on, but it's more common when particular content appears more than once in training data, like if pieces of it appear on lots of different public websites. So we have measures in place to limit inadvertent memorization and prevent regurgitation in model outputs. We also expect our users to act responsibly. Intentionally manipulating our models to regurgitate is not an appropriate use of our technology and is against our terms of use. Because models learn from the enormous aggregate of human knowledge, any one sector, including news, is a tiny slice of overall training data, and any single data source, including the New York Times, is not significant for the model's intended learning. Now, this is obviously where they're starting to get a little bit more forceful. They're hinting here that there has been some amount of intentional manipulation to regurgitate, and that's what brings them to bullet 4. The New York Times is not telling the full story. Basically, OpenAI says here that conversations had been going well all the way up to their last interaction, which had been December 19th. But then on December 27th, they heard about the lawsuit by reading about it in the New York Times. They said that the conversation had focused around a partnership around real-time data display with attribution, but that it wasn't about solely paying for access to New York Times data, as, quote, like any source, their content didn't meaningfully contribute to the training of our existing models and also wouldn't be sufficiently impactful for future training. But here's where they say things get fishy. Quote, along the way, they had mentioned seeing some regurgitation of their content, but repeatedly refused to share any examples despite our commitment to investigate and fix any issues. We've demonstrated how seriously we treat this as a priority, such as in July, when we took down a ChatGPT feature immediately after we learned it could reproduce real-time content in unintended ways. Interestingly, the regurgitations the New York Times induced appear to be from years-old articles that have proliferated on multiple third-party websites. It seems they intentionally manipulated prompts, often including lengthy excerpts of articles, in order to get our model to regurgitate. Even when using such prompts, our models don't typically behave the way the New York Times insinuates, which suggests they either instructed the model to regurgitate or cherry-picked their examples from many attempts. Despite their claims, this misuse is not typical or allowed user activity, and is not a substitute for the New York Times. Regardless, we are continually making our systems more resistant to adversarial attacks to regurgitate training data, and have already made much progress in our recent models. So basically they're saying that this random wirecutter example was some combination of 1, cherry-picked out of many attempts, and 2, something that the New York Times had to work really hard to get ChatGPT to produce, which minimizes their claim that ChatGPT is reasonably a substitute for the New York Times, which is of course part of their copyright claim. Now, the New York Times' only comment in response was from their lead counsel, Ian Crosby, who wrote, "The blog concedes that OpenAI used the Times' work along with the work of many others to build ChatGPT. As the Times complaint states, through Microsoft's Bing Chat, recently rebranded as Copilot, and OpenAI's ChatGPT, defendants seek to free-ride on the Times' massive investment in its journalism by using it to build substitutive products without permission or payment. That's not fair use by any measure." So effectively, we've just got the entrenchment of both sides here. So what did the community think? Well, it's mixed opinions. Brian Romley writes, "This is a well-thought-out response." Matthew Berman says, "OpenAI just dropped a bold response to the New York Times copyright lawsuit. They directly hit back with the claim that the New York Times is not telling the whole story. OpenAI even says NYT manipulated prompts, including lengthy excerpts of articles, in order to get our model to regurgitate." Andrew Ng, the co-founder of Coursera, wrote, "After reading the New York Times lawsuit against OpenAI and Microsoft, I find my sympathies more with OpenAI and Microsoft than with the New York Times. The suit 1 claims, among other things, that OpenAI and Microsoft use millions of copyrighted NYT articles to train their models. 2 gives examples in which OpenAI models regurgitated NYT articles almost verbatim. But the presentation muddies 1 and 2, and I saw a lot of commentary on social media that, because of what I believed is a muddied presentation, draws a link between them that I'm not sure what people think it is. On 1, I understand why media companies don't like people training on their documents, but believe that just as humans are allowed to read documents on the open internet, learn from them, and synthesize brand new ideas, AI should be allowed to do so too. I would like to see training on the public internet covered under fair use. Society will be better off this way. Though whether it actually is will ultimately be up to legislators and the courts. On 2, I suspect a lot of the examples of ChatGPT regurgitating articles nearly verbatim were due to a RAG-like mechanism where the user prompt causes the system to browse the web, retrieve a specific article, and then print it out. If this is the case, then to OpenAI's credit, they seem to have already updated their software to make this much less likely, and this is a much easier problem to fix than if an LLM were to regurgitate text using only the pre-trained weights, which as far as I know very rarely happens. To be clear, I believe independent media is important for democracy and must be protected. I also sympathize with media businesses worried about generative AI disrupting their business, but I'm not convinced the New York Times lawsuit is the right way to do this. Usual caveat, I am not a lawyer and not giving legal advice or any other form of advice here. Now, lawyer Cecilia Zaniti was less impressed. She writes, "TLDR, the blog post is weak, little data and odd citations, a missed opportunity for OpenAI, who has a good fair use case. To start, 2 odd choices by OpenAI. 1, they use a DALL-E image for the blog icon. It looks like an indie artist's work on Facebook. Why remind the reader about generative art too? 2nd, the blog post author is OpenAI. Better to have a person sign and humanize OpenAI. Hundreds of OpenAI employees signed the letter for Sam to stay. Not one signed this. Maybe they didn't want to be deposed." The biggest issue, though, she finds outside of style is the substance of the fair use part. Cecilia writes, "The topic is fair use. OpenAI has a great chance to win here. LLMs literally transform what they're trained on to new words. Transformative use is fair use per lots of great cases. But OpenAI skips any mention of actual fair use cases. Instead, OpenAI cites support from Adobe, IBM, and Grammarly, who all support Gen AI because they do it, surprise, creators no one has ever heard of, authors who are ... lawyers in Berkeley. Where are any big names? OpenAI could have gotten, say, their investor Reid Hoffman, author of 4 books and 250 podcasts, to sign. Instead, they got no one. Why?" Ultimately, though, Cecilia points out that this post is ultimately just a PR battle. She writes, "So what will happen from this blog post? Substantively, we can expect regurgitation to be the new hallucination," referring to OpenAI's naming of what the New York Times claims by identifying it as a problem that can be solved. Legally, however, she says, nothing. OpenAI's court response isn't due for some weeks. We'll have to wait for the court to decide. Ultimately, I think Cecilia is right, but I think that there really are 2 battles happening simultaneously. One is a public opinion battle, and the second is a legal battle. I think that it could be a split decision, and that split decision could have a lot of impacts. Ultimately, I can't envision any scenario where this doesn't make it all the way to the Supreme Court, so to some extent, everything before then is just prelude. Anyways, friends, that is the story from here. This is a battle that is coming big time in 2024. Until next time, peace.